This decision is already raising prices far beyond the battlefield. The Iran war was sold as pressure on Tehran, but pressure is never clean, and it rarely stays where politicians aim it. The first hit does not land only on missiles, shipping lanes, or oil terminals. It lands on fuel bills, inflation fears, flight costs, and the wider sense that global stability is getting more expensive. That is why this story matters now, because what looks far away can reach the viewer's wallet fast. Most people hear the surface version. Iran is at war, Trump is taking a harder line, and Putin is just watching from the side. But that misses the real structure underneath. When oil prices jump, sanctions bend, and buyers scramble for supply, Putin does not need to fire a shot to benefit. That is where the story gets bigger than the Middle East and starts touching energy, markets, inflation, and political leverage. By the end, you'll understand how Russia benefits from Iran war, why Trump's pressure campaign can end up boosting Putin, and how oil profits turn chaos into cash. You'll also see why India and China buying Russian oil are not side details, but core parts of the mechanism. This is not just about foreign policy headlines. It's about how a regional war can reshape Russia oil revenues, weaken sanctions on Russia, and change what the rest of the world pays for energy and stability. Stay until the end, because the final question might flip how you think about who really wins when oil panic takes over. Chapter 1. The War That Repriced Oil. The first shock did not land on a battlefield. It landed at the gas station, in airline costs, and in inflation bets. That's the part many people miss about the Iran war. Even before politicians explain it, markets reprice it. In March 2026, Brent posted its biggest monthly jump in decades as traders priced in disruption across the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. Think of the global oil market like a highway with one narrow bridge. The Strait of Hormuz is that bridge, and about 1/5 of global oil and LNG trade normally passes through it. Once war risk hit that route, traders didn't wait for total closure. They started bidding up fear itself. That pushed Brent above $118 at one point, helped send U.S. gasoline above $4 a gallon, and raised fresh worries about inflation, growth, and rate cuts. So even someone far from the Middle East feels this through fuel, shipping, food, flights, and shaky markets. And this is where Russia quietly enters the frame. When oil prices jump hard, every major exporter suddenly matters more, even the ones under pressure. That's why the Iran war is not just a regional security story, it's also the opening act of a money story. Like a fire raising the value of every bottle of water in the neighborhood, the panic alone can make Russian barrels more valuable before Moscow changes anything. But that leverage becomes far more dangerous when high prices stop being the only advantage. Chapter 2. Why higher oil prices help Russia. Russia doesn't need to win every sanction fight to make money. It just needs oil prices to jump high enough that each barrel becomes more valuable. That's the ugly math behind how Russia benefits from Iran war. Panic in the Gulf can refill Moscow's cash flow faster than many people expect. In March, Brent surged so sharply that even the Kremlin started talking openly about higher oil revenues. Oil revenues help fund war, pressure Europe, and keep global instability alive. Here's the mechanism. Russia is still one of the world's biggest energy exporters, so when oil prices move from around $70 toward or above $100, the state captures a large chunk through taxes and export-linked revenue. Russia's crude mineral extraction tax, its biggest oil tax item, could almost double in March because of the Middle East price rally, and April oil and gas revenues were expected to jump to about 0.9 trillion rubles. Putin himself warned Russia not to squander the windfall, which tells you the Kremlin sees this moment as real money, not just market noise. And this is where the story gets personal. More oil profits for Moscow don't stay on a spreadsheet. They can support budget stability, cushion sanctions on Russia, and stretch the war economy longer than outsiders hoped. So when people ask how Russia is getting rich from war, the first answer is brutally simple. The Iran war helped make every export barrel worth more. But higher prices become even more powerful when fear starts bending the rules that were supposed to isolate Russia. Chapter 3. How Trump's Iran strategy can end up helping Putin. Here's the twist nobody likes to say out loud. A strategy sold as pressure on Iran can end up padding Putin's balance sheet. Why? Because the market doesn't reward intentions, it rewards scarcity, fear, and disrupted supply. Trump said the Iran war could end in 2 to 3 weeks, but by then the oil shock had already ripped through prices and expectations. This is where the irony gets sharp. The harder the line against Iran, the bigger the chance of a prolonged supply scare in the Gulf, and that fear alone can boost Russia oil revenues. Brent posted a record 64% monthly jump in March, while U.S. gasoline moved above $4 a gallon, and 2/3 of Americans said they wanted a quick end to the war. Think of it like trying to flood one room in a house and discovering the water is leaking into your neighbor's basement too. The intended target might be Tehran, but the side effect can be oil profits flowing to Moscow, with viewers paying through inflation, energy, and market stress. And the timing is the real trap. Even if Trump calms markets later, or even if the war ends faster than feared, the earlier shock already changed pricing, trade behavior, and political pressure. That means Putin doesn't need a permanent crisis. He just needs enough panic for buyers, traders, and governments to start adjusting around higher prices. But this becomes even more consequential when emergency conditions start softening the enforcement of sanctions on Russia. Chapter 4. Sanctions Slippage During the Emergency. Sanctions look ironclad right up until the market gets scared. That is the uncomfortable part of any energy crisis. Principles hold until fuel shortages start hitting voters, factories, and transport networks. As the Iran war disrupted Middle East supply, the United States temporarily eased some sanctions on Russia, and countries across Asia started moving fast to secure barrels. Why does that matter right now? Because once supply fear takes over, sanctions on Russia can start bending in practice, even if the political language stays tough. That is how emergencies turn rules into negotiable tools. The proof is in the scramble. The Trump administration gave a temporary waiver that allowed some sea route Russian oil sales, while Asian buyers from the Philippines to Thailand, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam moved to line up Russian barrels. India also benefited from a temporary U.S. waiver, as it expanded imports from Russia and other sources to build a 60-day oil supply cushion during the disruption. When fuel becomes scarce, governments start asking not, is this consistent, but can we keep the country running? And that shift changes more than 1 month of trade. It tells Moscow that sanctions pressure can weaken when oil prices surge, shipping tightens, and inflation starts climbing in import-dependent economies. So price is only half the story. The other half is that crisis conditions can quietly reopen channels Russia needs to keep cash coming in. But this advantage becomes much bigger once India and China turn emergency flexibility into large-scale repeat demand. Chapter 5. India and China keep Russia in business. Russia does not make money from high oil prices alone. It needs giant buyers who can turn price spikes into real cash month after month. That is why India and China buying Russian oil matter so much in this story. Together, India and China take about 80% of Russia's oil exports, which means they're not a side note, they're the revenue machine. India is the clearest example of how fast this can move. As the Iran war disrupted flows through Hormuz, India secured a 60-day crude supply cushion, expanded imports from Russia, and benefited from a temporary U.S. waiver during the emergency. Reliance alone bought at least 6 million barrels of Russian crude for March, while broader talks pointed to Russian oil potentially climbing toward 40% of India's imports. Think of it like a supermarket panic. When one shelf looks shaky, buyers rush to the aisle that still has stock, even if they swore they would shop somewhere else. China plays a different role, but just as important. It has the scale, ports, traders, and refinery system to absorb huge volumes, and buyer interest in Russian oil was up in both India and China as Middle East supplies tightened. Even when some smaller Chinese refiners slowed purchases because rising crude costs squeezed margins, Russia still had what matters most: access to a massive buyer ecosystem that keeps its barrels in circulation. But this advantage becomes much bigger once India and China turn emergency flexibility into large-scale repeat demand. Understanding how Russia is getting rich from war helps the viewer read oil spikes, inflation shocks, and policy moves with a lot more clarity. It also helps explain why energy crises don't just punish one country. They often reward whoever still has supply when panic hits. The point is not that outcomes are fixed. They're not. Markets can calm down, sanctions can tighten again, and buyers like India and China can adjust if the costs or risks change. But none of that happens automatically. So what happens next if the Iran war drags on and oil prices stay high? Does Trump fully understand how a hard line on Iran can end up helping Putin? And if sanctions on Russia keep bending during emergencies, how strong are they really when the next crisis hits? Subscribe, turn on notifications, and keep learning how geopolitics, economics, and power shape your everyday life.